Hello and welcome to the Santa Rosa Chess Club. I'm your host today, Thomas Sutherland, and today we are going to be looking at 101 chess tips. And the author of this list is unknown. However, each of these tips is indeed vital and very, very important to understand. Number one, rapidly develop all pieces. The main goal at opening is to develop pieces and reach castling as quickly as possible. Opening is complete when one or both players have their rooks connected. If you look at the position here, the player who finishes the development first gains the initiative. Very, very important. Develop knights before bishops. Number two, while bishops can control several squares from their original position, if there are no pawns obstructing their way, knights dominate only their neighbors' squares and take longer to reach the opponent's field because they are less mobile pieces. Always develop knights before bishops. Don't move the same piece twice during the opening. Try to place your pieces at the best possible position at the first move. It is a waste of time to move the same piece more than once during the opening, and it may cost you the initiative in the game. Extremely important. Don't make unnecessary pawn moves during the opening, and there are a multitude of reasons for this, especially as we get into understanding pawn play more. Pawn moves should be restricted during opening because the time involved in these moves could be applied to develop another piece. Generally, moving pawns is suitable when the player aims to open diagonals for the queen or bishops or occupy the center. Also, what is not mentioned here is that on the first move, a pawn, especially as it relates to the endgame, a pawn can move, of course, either one or two squares, and this may be important in the ending to throw a tempo off. Something to consider, and also especially the pawns in front of the king. After we castle here, these pawns, flat pawns, are stronger. Flat pawns are strong pawns in front of the king. Always remember that. Don't check if not necessary. A check that can easily be defended by the opponent is unnecessary. Most of the checks during opening can easily be defended by moves that favor development. Also, another very important reason for not uh, checking unnecessarily is that one of the main reasons that a player loses a game of chess is by attacking too early. Also, in this situation with uh, Queen E2 check, the queen blocks in the bishop here. Not good. 6. Don't open a position if you are late in development. An open position favors the color with more pieces in the game. Therefore, only the player who has an advantage in development should produce an open position. Also very important to keep in mind that open positions favor bishops. So depending upon if you are playing bishops versus knights, you might want to open the position favorably for your bishops, of course. And if you are using the knights versus bishops, you're going to want to keep the positions closed as much as possible to prevent the bishops from having your opponent's bishops from having more scope. 7. Place the queen behind the line of friendly pawns during the opening. Since the queen is a very powerful piece, it is also very vulnerable to the opponent's constant attacks. Therefore, it's convenient to place it behind a pawn, preferably on the second rank, so that the first one is free for rook development. This is a good idea, not necessarily for the way that it was explained. Of course, this second rank is the opponent's seventh rank, and controlling this is very important. I'm not so sure I completely agree with this. Proper placement of the queen is very, very important, and not too many queen moves in the beginning of the game might be a good way to look at that. Avoid trading a developed piece for a non-developed one. Generally, it's a bad deal to trade a well-positioned piece for a bad-positioned one. When you trade one of the developed pieces for one of your opponent's not developed pieces, you waste time. Very, very true, but there are exceptions to this rule, of course. The same is true if you trade a piece that has moved a lot for one that your opponent moved only once, and that goes back to the earlier rule. Generally speaking, a good idea, um, and certainly trading the bishop for the knight here is a very, very poor idea, to say the least. This bishop is very well placed here so far. Okay. Castle as quickly as possible. The king's safety is one of the most important things to care about during the opening and middle game. The king in the center will always be vulnerable to the opponent's attacks, especially in open positions. Castling means placing your king comfortably behind a pawn blockade and allowing development of one of your rooks. Then the rook may rapidly occupy an open or half-open file. This is a very, very good rule. There are exceptions to it as well, of course, because one can castle um, a move or two moves too early, allowing the opponent to develop in a way that you would not want them to. In other words, pay attention to development, your opponent's development, and generally speaking, castling early is very good, but there are times when you want to keep an eye on your opponent's development before castling. Okay. 10. Kingside castling is safer than queenside castling. Kingside castling places the king away from the center and safer behind a rank of protected pawns. Furthermore, it's a quicker move than queenside castling since only two pieces have to be moved beforehand. On the other hand, castling on the opponent's opposite side may be very interesting to create more attacking opportunities. Absolutely. It certainly depends on the position. Um, and generally speaking, castling, for the reasons mentioned here, castling short, as we say, is a better idea. And a lot of your development, a lot of your opening knowledge and strategies will be better served because we tend to look at these more than castling queenside or castling long. Again, it depends on the situation. It depends on your opponent's development, your development, and where you plan to go. If we wanted to launch an attack on the king side here, it might very well be that we would prefer to castle queenside. So again, it depends on the particular position. 11. Try to prevent the opponent from castling. A very good idea. Now in this position we have bishop a3 here, preventing so far the black king from castling short. A good idea in general, and if you can manipulate this position uh, to great advantage, it's definitely a good way to go. Again, there are exceptions to the rule. In other words, if this bishop is better placed elsewhere. Okay. 12. Dominate as much territory as possible. The player who has an advantage in space enables greater mobility to friendly pieces and can, therefore, transfer pieces from one side to the other with more flexibility. On the other hand, the player in a more restricted position finds it difficult to maneuver pieces, which might be fatal if they are requested to defend the king. A very good rule in general, and also understanding that uh, this advantage in space, controlling more of the board, might be a more precise way to look at that. It is certainly advantage controlling uh, more of the board or more space. 13. Advance pawns in order to conquer space. Although advancing pawns is the main resource to restrict the opponent's position, this rule should be considered carefully because the fairer the pawns, far is not a word, I'm sorry. The further the pawns are from base position, the harder it is to defend them. This is that's a very good point here. Um, and also, we do not want to overextend, and many of you have already looked at that, and some of us have discussed the importance of not overextending. Also, this pawn move does weaken this diagonal for the bishop, so something to keep in mind. And we're gonna get very, very deep into pawn play, and and look at the immortal work of Hans Kamak on that coming up. Okay, 14. As pawns advance, they get more difficult to protect, and this goes back to Rule 13, right? Like like we just looked at. Yes, of course they become more difficult to protect. A weak pawn is one that is not defended by another pawn, which means that it must be defended by pieces, which when it is under attack. Those pieces lose much of their effectiveness because they have to assume a defensive role while enemy pieces get an active role. Uh, Very, very important rule. And again, we're talking about overextension here, and yeah. So a good one to remember. As pawns advance, they get more difficult to protect. 15. Place your pawns in the center. The center of the chessboard consists of e4, e5, d4, and d5. These four squares here, and control of these four squares ultimately will decide who controls the game. There is not a single game of chess that is won without control of the center unless the opponent makes a series of very poor decisions. The expanded center also includes the squares that form the C3, C6, F3, and F6 rectangle. So we're looking at this rectangle here. Okay, and also something to consider about the center pawn and the pawns as far over as the uh, next to the rim. We could say file. A pawn here is defending these two squares or attacking these two squares. A pawn on the rim is only defending or attacking one square. So your center pawns are much stronger than a flank pawn or rim pawn, as we will get into looking at closer with the work again of Hans Kamak. Pawns are the best units to create the center because different from pieces, they are not vulnerable to attack of enemy pawns. That's interesting. We could look at that very carefully for quite a while. It almost doesn't make sense, but moving on. 16. Keep your pieces as close as possible to the center. Again, very, very important. And well, let's go ahead. In the center, a piece controls more squares. That is absolutely true. Very important to keep in mind. Than anywhere else on the board. The knight, for instance, may move to 8 different squares from the center, while it only has 2 options when placed in the corners. The control of the center is also important because it enables pieces to move rapidly from one side of the board to the other. And if your pieces move faster than your opponent's pieces, you have greater chances to create a successful attack. And something else to look at here, let's take, for example, the bishop. The bishop is going to be strongest or control more space on this longest white diagonal. Same is true or I guess you could say the inverse is true, for the dark squared bishop on this long dark squared diagonal. So that's something very, very, very important to keep in mind as well. Your bishops are stronger on the longer diagonals, and there are exceptions to that as well, of course, when it comes to tactics and when it comes to mating combinations, of course. 17. When trading pawns, try to get yours as close as possible to the center. If 2 of your pawns can retake the opponent's piece that previously captured one of your pieces, it is recommended to move that pawn, the pawn that, at the end, will be closest to the center, since central pawns are more important than lateral ones. So the idea is that you want to capture, a simple way of putting this is you want to capture towards the center. Almost always. There are exceptions, but you absolutely want to capture towards the center. Capturing away from the center, for example, this direction for this black F pawn, or capturing this way is generally not a good idea. You want to capture towards the center in most cases. So, okay, moving on here.